Game Design 2, first main project of the year, and I'm so excited to do this with you. Let's go ahead and set it up, and then I'll talk to you about the project as it opens. So let's go to New. Let's create a project, 3D project here. 3D Racer is what I'm going to call it. And I'm going to change my location. I'm going to create a new folder on my desktop called 3D Racer. You might have a window that looks a little bit different where you have to click see details to see all of this. But on my desktop it says 3D Racer. I'm going to select that folder, perfect, and hit create. So let's talk about this project a little bit while I get started. This project is based off of a tutorial series by someone named Jimmy Vegas on YouTube. Fantastic stuff. We'll be using more of his stuff this year because it's kind of where we want to be with the what's the word for it? Middle of the ground projects. Looking at the skills that we need to have by the end of Video Game Design 2, the two main projects we're doing this year cover most of that ground. So I wanted to give due credit to him for the work that he's done. I'm using a lot of the assets and some of the process he's doing. But I have changed parts of the project to be more in line with what we have done in the past and where we want to go in the future. So while this finishes importing, I'll fast forward this and I'll catch you once that's done. So, projects open up. We're inside of the sample scene right here. We can see our assets folder here, and we should have a game window available. You can drag it over if you'd like, so that you can see what you're working on. And I'm going to make sure that it's 16 by 9. That's my normal sort of thing. We're going to be using something in the asset store, and for some reason, I'm not really sure why, I have trouble finding it via, inside the app. So I'm going to put a link in Classroom for you to the terrain tool. So the first part of the project is going to be working with the terrain tool. So the link will take you here, and we're going to open that up in Unity. Sometimes when you click on it, it might not take you directly to it. Let me change it to my assets, see if that helps too. Sometimes that does help. There you go. So when this is open, you're going to hit, you might have to hit a download button and then import like this. Give it a second. So the first part of the project is going to be us making a map in the world. So I'm going to close my package manager here and go back into my scene. I don't need the game view right now, but I'm just going to slide it back over here and then click on my scene. So I'm going to go into over here and hit plus. And I'm excited to get started. 3D terrain. And that's going to drop in this huge, flat, plain-like area. And the first thing I want to make sure is being done is you're going to see in the inspector, terrain is the name. That's fine. Transform. There's a bunch of tools here. We're going to kind of go through those. And then the collider for this. Let's go over to the gear. And just so that we have all of our distance the way we want it to be, I'm going to scroll down to where it says, let's make sure mesh resolution is set to 1000 by 1000. You should have that, but if you don't, I want to make sure that's the case. So let's talk about how we do terrains. I'm going to double click on it in the hierarchy as a reminder of how you do that. If you recall, Option on a MacBook allows you to rotate your camera this way. So even though we can't really tell, this is actually a very large map that we're looking at. It's pretty big. So up here underneath terrain, the terrain component in the inspector, you have a brush tool. And when you click on it, there's a couple things going on here. You have it's currently selected to raise and lower terrain. There's a paint texture, set height, smooth height, and stamping as well. So this is how you change what your brush does, is on that menu there. There's a little bit of information here, so left click to raise, and then you hold shift on your keyboard to lower that. You also can choose different brushes here. The reason why we downloaded that package was you could already do terrain beforehand, but there weren't as many brushes for you to have access to. So we basically downloaded a few more options when it comes to brushes and the way the textures work and so on. You also have brush size and opacity. So I'm going to show you what those look like. So I'm going to just choose this classic brush here. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so I can kind of see what it looks like. So this is what the brush looks like. If I click once, it leaves it like a little section there. And if I hold down Shift and click, it kind of gets rid of it. It works backwards, inversely. So click, and if I hold it down, and as I move, you can tell it just kind of like spirals up. For me, that's one of the harder parts of using the brush tool, is that while you're painting with it, you kind of keep moving. And then once you hold and sort of drag, you get these huge mountains. So it's a little difficult sometimes to work in the way you want it to. So I'm going to Command Z, and it'll step back and between the times that you first clicked and when you last clicked, so we can keep going backwards. Let's look how brush size impacts this. So you can just tell definitely that it changes the way the brush is working. Okay, let's step back again, and then opacity is the depth at which this moves. So how much is occurring at each point. So if I really turn this down, you're not going to see much. So my suggestion is for painting terrain is to turn your opacity down some so you can kind of have more control over what your brush is doing. And then, going back and adding some different styles of brushes to kind of shape the land and kind of make it feel more organic. So I want to show you really quick before you start going off on your own. Let me show you how to some smooth heights as well. So smoothing applies that brush texture, but it makes it feel a lot more, smooth. It evens it out. You might not be able to see it as much here, but you can kind of see my little lines, like these variation lines sort of changing a little bit. Let's increase the opacity, so the amount of smoothing that's occurring. And now you can see that my lines aren't so jagged. I have a much more smoother mountain compared to what I had here. So smoothing is really, really helpful as well. So we're going to add a package here. I'm going to give you tons of time before, to start building out your level. I want to step back here to get rid of all that smoothing. Okay. One more thing I want to look at with you is adding textures to this. You have a package in Classroom called 3D Racer Asset Package. I'm going to want you to download it, and then you're going to drag it into your project folder down here. And import these things. So this includes a few images, a few songs, and more importantly, the standard assets package, which is sort of not used very often anymore in Unity. So I had to do a little fix to it to make it work for you guys. But in there, it has a couple different things that we're going to be using for this project. Most specifically, it's going to have a prefabbed car and some scripts that allow us to do car AI. So we're going to let this finish compiling, and I'll catch up with you in just a second. So here we are again, and we have our asset package totally downloaded. And we know that because we have audio, materials, objects, samples, scenes, standard assets, and textures. One thing I'll go ahead and ask you to do is in your project area, create a new folder, and we're going to go ahead and call that one, oops. So what happened here was I was already clicked on a folder, and so it created inside my textures folder. That's fine. I'm going to move it back out in a second. So I'm just going to control right click. I'm going to name that terrain, and I'll move it back out to assets. I can drag it over here in this window. So now that it's out here. And I'm going to, whenever we created our terrain, it creates a terrain data file that holds information about what we've done here. So I'm going to drag it into here so it's not just sitting out in our assets folder. So there is a folder called textures. And in here, you're going to see grass, rock, and asphalt. We're going to apply this grass texture to this area here. So, you know what we haven't done in a little bit? We haven't saved our sample scene. So I'm going to Command S that and save that. And actually, what I really would prefer to do is go into Scenes, rename this. I want to call this one track 01. It'll ask us to reload. That way we have a definitive name instead of sample scene, and it's saved in our scenes folder. So this will be our first track of the game. And I'm going to hit Command S to make sure that it's saved. Got to get back in the practice of saving. So on our terrain object, under brushes, we're going to look for paint texture. Right here. Paint texture under that option. And currently we have no terrain layers. So we're going to edit our terrain layers and create a new one. And currently we don't have anything here, but we have a grass. If you type in grass here, you have grass 001. And that's the one we want to use. Double click on that. And it applies a grass texture. If you zoom in, you can kind of see the grass texture repeating here over and over on our big plane. That gives you a sense of how big the scaling is. If the grass texture looks like this here, you have to zoom way in to be able to see that. Now you have a new layer here, and I'm going to just drag that into our textures folder. And go into your textures folder again. Oh, well, before I do that, so you'll notice whenever we clicked on that new layer, the terrain layer, you have a couple slots that open up in the inspector: a diffuse map, a normal map, and a mask map. We won't really talk about mask maps, but we're going to talk about a few different things about what diffuse versus normal maps are. So I wanted to stop here and do a quick explanation about albedo, diffuse, height maps, and normal maps, and just explain these different types of textures. It's really important to kind of understand them as we get further into 3D development. So let's take a step back. You are probably familiar with albedo. When we made materials before in Unity, we would create a new material and then we'd go select albedo, and it would just basically create a colored material that we would drag onto our objects. So albedo is like basically a color shader or texture that includes no information about lighting. The difference is that albedo just the color, but it includes light sources, and that's the next step of that. Would be a diffuse map. Diffuse mapping does the same thing, but includes information about how lighting should be responding to the surface. So it includes a little bit of information about reflection and so on. So think of albedo as the most basic version, and then with adding lighting information on top of that is diffuse. Now normal maps, I'm going to use this great article here to help kind of explain this. So normal mapping, let's look at this right here. So this is called a bump map or height maps. Height maps are these textures that tell the computer like how it's supposed to give an appearance of height or bumps across the surface, but it didn't actually add any geometry. This is still a perfectly smooth square with no pattern on it, but we are tricking the light to reflect as if there were a surface here, just like an image sitting on the surface here. So we have some shadow and things like that, but it doesn't actually add any real geometry, which is great, but you don't get lots of great detail. Another type of map we're not really using right now is called displacement. And displacement looks a lot more realistic because it actually tells the camera to warp the lighting in different areas, but it's very expensive, as you can see right here. It looks really good, but it costs a lot of computational processing power. Normal mapping is sort of in between the two. This is what normal mapping here looks like. So it's red, green, blue, RGB, and each color tells the renderer which direction the light should be going. So it's very much like this height map here, where it's not adding any polygons, and it just uses a color to kind of give a sense of detail. So it looks much better than the height map, while without costing as much as this displacement mapping here. So for all explanations, height maps are a false sense of depth using black and white, and then normal maps use red, green, blue to give a sense of height. And it adds details without adding any polygons. So it just tells it an angle at which light is supposed to leave. So that makes a huge difference in the way something looks. So currently, our grass looks, it has a texture repeated over and over, but it has no sense of depth or anything like that. And the way to cheat that is to add in a normal map. So in your textures, assets textures, we're going to take grass 001 and we're going to Command D to duplicate that. So now it should be called grass 001 space 1. And I'm going to rename it, Control right click, if you need to do it that way. Rename that. I'm just going to put a underscore N so that I will know that this is meant to be a normal map. Over here in the inspector, you have your texture type. I'm going to change it from default to normal map. And then you have to hit the apply button. And now you'll notice that this has switched to a 3-color texture, all we call RGB, red, green, blue, the 3 primary colors. So back on your new layer that you created here, where it says normal map, drag in this texture, and then you'll see that the ground actually seems to have, like, there's a difference in the way it looks on my right-hand screen versus the left because the lighting has changed a little bit. It perceives like a sense of depth here. So it makes your grass feel a little bit more realistic. And you can do a couple different things. You can play with the metallic stuff. I don't think you really need that. The smoothness, I wouldn't really play with that. Those are set well, but those are things that you can do with this whole layer. But back on your normal map, to have it operate a little bit more like a height map, I'm going to click on Create from Grayscale and hit Apply. And you might like the way that looks a little bit more. It might feel a little bit more realistic to you. And that'll be your call. I don't really think you need to play with anything else, but I just wanted you to see how adding just a simple 2D image and then changing it into a normal map gives you an opportunity to have light play with it, give you a sense of depth, make it feel a little bit more real. It does make a big difference. So we have this big green plane here. What we're going to do is before we start getting into putting like mountains and things in, I actually just want to go ahead and make a track. So we're going to create a new texture on our terrain here. Paint texture, make sure you have that selected. And right now, you know what I'm going to do? Let's go ahead and let's rename this texture layer so we don't confuse ourselves. So we'll call it grass. Just call it grass layer. That is totally fine. Let's make sure that the terrain sees it. Yes. I don't like leaving things unlabeled properly. Edit terrain layers. We're going to create a layer. And we'll look for this texture here, asphalt 01. Double click on it. There you go. And you see in your textures area you have a new one. I'm going to go ahead and control right click, rename that into asphalt layer so I don't get it confused with the actual texture. We're going to do the same thing. We already have the asphalt texture as our diffuse, so the thing that's interpreting light patterns and just general color like albedo. And I'm going to take asphalt 001, Command D to duplicate it, and rename the one that's known as 001 space 1 to underscore N for normal map. So on this one, you're probably ahead of me already, default normal map. And I will go ahead and grayscale this. I kind of like the way that looks, so I'm going to apply that. You're still going to see RGB. You're going to still see the flecks of red and green in here. But still, it's not direct. It's not exactly a height map, but it's closer to that. On our back on that layer, let's drag in that new normal map. So that's done. All right, so we're going to make a section of the track. On terrain, I'm going to switch my brush back to, we're going to keep it on paint texture. Click on this. Now, what brush did I have? Yeah, scroll down to your brush and see what that looks like. Yeah. So you can see it's painting as if it were pretty large. Now, what I went with, the numbers I went with a size 20 brush, which is going to look pretty small. And let's go ahead. I think I did metallic a little bit on the asphalt layer. So I'm going to turn this metallic up just some to kind of give it like this wet look. Now you'll see the brush is a lot smaller, but that's totally fine. So whenever you start making your track, can I encourage you not to overdo it? I would suggest maybe keeping 1 or 2 turns in it. So before you get started, just kind of look generally what I'm doing, because looking ahead when we do enemy AI and things like that, the more turns you have, things are going to get way more complicated. And so since this is our first go, our first track, I would suggest for yourself and for the player to keep it somewhat simple. So what I would suggest is I just do like a road like this maybe. I kind of went with like a kidney bean design the first time I did this, so I might just stick with that. 1 or 2 turns like this, and I could do one more little one right there. Let's see if that's looking good. Yeah, that looks okay. Don't forget you have a panning tool here that you can use to kind of drag and look. I like that. I think that looks pretty good. So, before I ask you to go draw your thing, let me play that metallic surface a little bit. So when I add metallic to it, you can see it darkens it up, but more importantly, it'll reflect light a little bit differently. So I think that looks pretty good for a first track. So go ahead and draw your first track, and I'll meet you here just in 1 second. Okay. The last thing we'll do for this video is 2 things. We're going to add a rock texture around the edge of your track in some areas. And then we'll go ahead and add our hills along the outside, since you already know how to do that. So, zooming in, just find an area here. We're going to do the same thing we've done before with terrain. I'm going to go to the brush, make sure it's on paint texture. I'm going to add create a new texture, new layer, sorry. And I'm going to look for rock, and you should see rock 001. There you go. I'm going to rename that new layer into rock layer. Boom. Take my rock 001. I'm going to command D to duplicate it and rename that new one to rock 001 underscore N for my normal map. Change that normal map from default to normal map. And I'm going to grayscale it again and hit apply. You don't have to grayscale. Just note that you don't have to do that. Okay, on terrain, paint texture. Make sure I'm on rock layer so that I can, what to paint with. My brush, I made it a lot smaller for this one. I think I went with a size 3. Okay. So what I did, yeah. So along the edges, I just sort of put rocks around this thing. And so I would suggest you go ahead and do that. You don't have to do it for all your sections, but take a good, section of your track and add in this rock texture. Okay, so I took some sections here. I'm not going to do as much as I would probably suggest you do. I took some sections here and I painted in with rock. Now, what I would suggest to do is to take the rocks, switch from paint texture to lower raised terrain, and I changed my opacity from 80 to something like, was it 0.3? Something like really low. Yeah, to give me some control over that. And I just start lifting my rocks up. Um, let's see what 0.6 looks like. I feel like I can get, not 6, I want 0.6. There you go. Yeah, 0.6 is fine too. It gives you some more control. So any of your rock sections, you can try different brushes as well, right? Try this right here. Do I like that a little more? Yeah, that feels a little more natural. Try raising those sections up, and you can just keep going over them to kind of get that lift that you're looking for right here. So yeah, that looks pretty good. So go ahead and raise the height on your rock sections. Okay, so I just did this one little section here. I raised the height on it for just for the sake of getting done with it for the sake of the video. The last thing I'm going to do for this video is I'm going to ask you to go ahead and add in some mountains, or yeah, for now we're just going to add in like mountain areas, which, if you're on your brush over here, raise and lower terrain, I would start with a very simple brush like this here, and I'm going to change my opacity. I don't know, let's try what 10 looks like. Brush size, I'm going to ramp that up a little bit. Let's go like 20. See what we're seeing here. Yeah. Now, the thing I'm asking for you to do is to close off your track around the outside, and, close off the means for your player to cut across the track. Now, we're going to fix that so that the game they're not able to win the race, even if they were able to cross, but don't give them the option. So I'm just going to put some hills up around here. I'm just tracing kind of where I want it to be. Something like this. Nothing too intense right now. And then when I'm done with putting these few hills in, I'm going to go in. I might increase my brush size a little bit. And 100's a lot, though. Let's go 50. See what that looks like. Yeah, 50 might be right. I'm going to go back again and kind of fill this in some more. And I don't like the way it looks right now, but that's because I know I can go back in with the smoothing tool and smooth it out, and try some other brushes as well. I really like this brush here because that feels a little more like normal to me, because it makes the base of the hills look like what a mountain should look like. Just try to make sure there's no areas that your player can just drive over. Once you kind of finish putting in I'll put some more mountains out here. Kind of fill it in, so they want to go around that side. Once you kind of finish putting in these mountains, I would suggest going back and smoothing the height a little bit. Try some different brushes again to make them look a little more natural, a little more normal. You maybe can raise your opacity some if you want to get more height, more smoothing out of the brush. See, I think that's looking pretty good here. Yeah. And then the last thing is go ahead and add in a area around the outside. Switch my smooth height back to raise and lower terrain. Let's try this one instead. Yeah, that one looks way too fake to me. I don't really like the way that looks. I'm going to stick with this little starburst. And then add on the one on the outside surface of your map. So I have finished adding in my outer surface of my racetrack. Trying to make sure that whatever I'm doing is closing off any potential way for my player to get out of here. So I'm going to try to scale around, look around. Been checking. I've tried a couple different brushes here. This one was pretty cool. I liked the way that one looked. It's a little more rugged, I guess you'd say. Um, Going through, checking heights, make sure they can't get through the inside, and then going back in and smoothing the height out. I've been using a different brush for that, just trying to make it feel a little less unnatural, like in the way the texture plays out. So I think that helps. I was trying to stay off the track some here. Like this area here kind of encroached on that. So I might go down to raise and lower texture, go take an area, and hold down shift to kind of smooth that area out some. That doesn't look great, but that'll be okay for what we're doing right now. So the last thing I want to show you for doing the terrain mapping is adding trees in. So under assets here, we have a folder called objects, and in there I've already given you tree 001 that comes with a diffuse, a normal map, which we've talked about now, and a shadow map. But it has a prefab object here. It has like a bunch of different leaves and different sections to it already built for you. So instead of us trying to drag and drop these into the world, we're going to use our brush to do that. So under terrain, there is a paint trees option. Click there. And right now we don't have any trees. So we are going to edit trees, add tree. And right now we don't have a game object, but we're going to grab this tree 001, put it right in there. Perfect. And hit the add button. And this works just like what you've seen so far. You're going to have a brush size, all that stuff, tree density. So we're going to start painting in some trees like that. I'm going to click off, and you notice right now they're blue when you're far away. I'm going to use Q, and then I'm going to zoom in and try to look at these guys. So there you go. The reason why they're blue when they're far away, we'll fix the density of this too, is because of a option. So under terrain, settings here, change the billboard. I gotta remember that. It's a billboard start right here. I changed that on to 250. And what you'll see now is that billboard start is how far away does it start showing these. So when you're driving around your car, you know something like kind of starts popping on the edge of the screen. It's because the billboard start is a little too far out. I think this is fine. So for painting our trees, I'm going back to trees here. I would play with I like putting randomization on, and then making sure lock with the height there, and you can reduce your tree density some. You notice that because my brush is small, it's not doing nearly as much. So you can do two things. You can either up your brush size like I am. And that's how you kind of get them more spread out, but I have no control when I do that, so Command Z. So deal with a smaller brush, and then play with like 33 worked really well for me. Tree density 46, that's pretty good for me. And I like to have a denser set of trees closer to the mountains because that's kind of what naturally occurs. And then a less, dense amount of trees further up towards the road. So we have one tree here that we can do, and then of course we can edit trees. Add tree. And I'm going to go back out of objects to tree 2 and drag this guy in. Hit add. And then now that we go back to terrain, you have two trees. Make sure you select the one you want, and the same kind of deal. Along the road, I'm going to do, a little less density. I want more density than that. And maybe reduce my brush size just a little bit. See what we get. That gives me a little bit more control, even though I think I inadvertently painted on the road there. Give your players some grace. By that I mean like don't put trees like right up on the road all the time. Give them some room, especially around corners, to kind of make those turns. Let's go a little more dense back here near the edge. So that looks a little more normal, like that. Yeah, so go ahead and populate the rest of your areas with some trees and yeah, make it look good. We might do a little bit more. You can also, of course, blend these together if you want, because that feels more natural. That's how trees work anyways, right? Yep. So that will be it for this terrain video. When we start next time, we're going to be looking at adding our car and we're getting the camera to work.